slave state for as long as they decide the only future that you can see for your children and for your grandchildren is one where any job they have is controlled by China, where they can never ensure that the person in power will represent the needs of the people or just be a puppet of the Chinese. On our side, we support sovereignty. We believe in the right of states to choose their own future. We bring you a three-part case. Firstly, the principle as to why this strips nations of their sovereignty. Secondly, as to why the Belt and Road Initiative is bad for these states in the long term. And thirdly, my second speaker will be telling you about how this cripples democracy. But firstly, what is the Belt and Road Initiative? The Belt and Road Initiative is Chinese investment in building infrastructure like roads and ports along the old Silk Road, all of which lead back to China. So what does this look like? This looks like giving very, very poor people loans to buy mansions that you know they will never be able to repay. Because you can kick them out of these houses at any time, they will always do whatever they want to please their owners, leaving you with total control over them. This is what the Belt and Road Initiative looks like. What we prefer on proposition is any other financial institution that will give good loans in terms of carrying out risk assessments and making sure these nations can actually pay them back, and who care about things like human rights violations. China does none of these. So firstly, why this strips nations of their sovereignty. We believe that sovereignty in these nations is very, very important because without it, it takes away their choice to decide their future by making them dependent on China for as long as they repay a debt to them. So this happens in three ways. Firstly, when you start building these roads, when you start building these ports, these countries can never ever protest against China, because then the alternative is China can just threaten to leave these half done when they are making a loss and can't actually be used. So what this actually looks like is when China encroaches in the South China Sea against Vietnam, Vietnam can now never protest because then all its roads and all its ports are going to be half done and making a loss. So then they need to accept any violation that China does to them. Secondly, I'll take in a minute, after the infrastructure is built, all roads and all ports lead back to China, right? So if any of these countries choose to switch and trade with the West, they can't do this because their transportation and infrastructure is useless and the costs are too high, making their products unprofitable. They have to keep things profitable, to keep things manageable, they have to trade into China, and they're locked into this forever. Yes.
Why is any of this a violation of sovereignty if these nations opt into the Belt and Road of their own volition?
Okay, I'm going to come on to this, but when you're locking in future generations and you're locked in forever into China, this strips away sovereignty because you have no other choice to do anything apart from what China tells you, right? I'm going to come on to this. But thirdly, this forces you to own, because you owe a huge debt to China, because at any point China can threaten to recall those debts, it means that they can force you to support Chinese policy, force you to employ only Chinese companies, locking you into Chinese ideals, because you have to repay that debt, and the only way you can do this is by supporting China. So what this looks like is for generations to come, you can never ever reject China. You are like a slave to China. This is neo-colonialism because you can never ever defy the Chinese. We believe that this is morally repugnant because the current government is trading away choice for future generations to have any say over what will benefit their country, any say into going against China, and making future people who never consented into a lifetime locked into Chinese trading and locked into Chinese incentives. We believe that sovereignty is the most fundamental attribute of a nation, and without this, these nations become a slave state because they can never defy those who they owe this money to. Opposition has to tell us how they can maintain sovereignty under their side of the house, and that cannot just be they opted into it, because that choice still does not exist under their side. Secondly, why this is bad for the countries. Now, we believe that a lot of other people, the USA, the World Bank, and things like that, are going to invest in these countries because in the long term they are profitable, right? So if they come up and tell us that China are the only people giving money to these countries, then perhaps you need to ask yourself this. Why is China the only one giving money to these countries? And secondly, why is this in the forms of loans and not in the forms of aids and gifts? Because if these roads were actually profitable, then if these ports were actually profitable, then private investors would be putting their money into it. The fact that China is doing it, no one else is showing that China is willing to make a financial loss. We don't buy them outside of the house that China expects no return from this. So So we have to concede that the only, what they get in return for this is power and political influence, right? Because all these nations are now locked into a puppet state. So when China decides they're not happy with you, they say, oh, we can't convince the CPC members to extend the time of your loan. Essentially meaning that these countries are never able to oppose China and always have to follow these policies. So what does this look like, right? Yeah, I'll take you.
What's the difference between America giving countries loans and China giving countries loans?
Okay, here's the difference. If America gives you loans, firstly, they're going to calculate the fact that you're probably going to pay them back at some time, so their intention is to make profit, not the power of political influence. Also, secondly, they care about things like human rights violations. They care if you're locking up journalists. And we think that this is also very, very important, right? That is the difference that we have. So what does this look like in the real world? This looks like when Ukraine decides that it's better for them financially to trade with the West and not with Russia. Russia can at any moment turn off their taps for gas and leave them in the Stone Age. So no matter how much it benefits them to trade with the West, they are locked into Russia because they have no other alternative. This is what is going to happen to all these nations under the Belt and Road Initiative. But why is this different to places like America and the World Bank, right? Because you can only get money here if you can prove you can pay it back, or if you're on the trajectory to be able to do so in the future. China doesn't care about this for two reasons. One, because if you default on your loans, they can take away the collateral. So in the case of Pakistan, this is literal gold mines, right? We're not saying that they will do it, but if these places are defaulted, it is in their capacity to do so. But also, secondly, it is not in China's incentive to actually get these countries to pay back their loans, because as long as they owe the money, as long as they have their ports, as long as they're locked into China, they will always do business with China, even if it's against their best interests. Actually, I'll take a few.
So doesn't that mean that your initial argument that there's a massive debt burden that can never be paid back, you just made that redundant by saying they will actually never ask for these countries, China will never ask the countries to pay back?
No, what we're saying is that they'll use the threat of recalling their loans all the time to get these countries to pass policies that benefits China, because they can recall them at any point, right? That's what we're saying. So what does this look like? This looks like European debt in African nations. When Europe lends huge amounts of money to countries in Africa and say, knowing that they can never pay it back, we now think that Europe uses this to control Africa. Because then when certain nations in Africa want to take protectionist policies, such as putting tariffs, when they protest the common agricultural policies, they can't do any of this. Because these loans have a set time period, and the European nations can at any point ask to call them back if these countries do anything to oppose them. But what does this look like? China can increase interest rates by geometric proportion from 5% to 10%. And the only way these countries can sustain themselves is by being slaves to the Chinese. And this means that they can never undergo policies that will benefit them unless those policies will benefit the Chinese. This looks like financial policies, this looks like social policies, this looks like locking up journalists. Unless it benefits China, unless it's an ideal with them, they can never do it. All needs to show us how China in every situation can provide the best case scenario, otherwise they lose the debate. We are very proud to propose.
8 minutes and 19 seconds. I would like to thank the first speaker of the proposition for their speech, and would like to invite the first speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, first I'd like to thank your first speaker for that wonderful speech. Now, before I get into my main points of my main substances, I'd like to offer a few points of rebuttal or contention. Now, firstly, you're bringing up this idea that China is going to be enslaving these countries and that they do not have a choice. China is this big evil entity, and that these countries have no other choice but, and they'll hold these loans over their heads for their entire lives. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are offering on our side of the house is choice. They can choose. If they do not want to buy into this, if they do not want to be a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, then they do not have to, and that is something that Team Proposition has not grasped today. That is why debt will not be a burden for them, because, or it could be, however, they know that that is what they are going into. China is being very transparent with this initiative, and it is very, very clear what these countries are getting themselves into. Now, again, you're talking about this whole idea that, no thank you, that nations are going to be stripped of their serenity. However, this will not happen simply because they know what they're going into. China is transparent. They are very open about this. Now, also, I'd like to ask you, what is your better alternative? So we're talking about the USA. So the US giving loans. What is the difference, ladies and gentlemen? Because, you know, you spoke about, you're right. No, thank you. You spoke about how the USA care. Oh, that's so sweet. They care about locking up journalists. Are you really trying to argue that the USA is the most moral country? The USA has overthrown countless governments simply because they didn't agree with the ideologies of them? Not only that, but you're talking about China, no thank you. You're talking about China enslaving countries, and then your alternative is the USA. Do you not see the irony and the contradictions in your argument? Now, ladies and gentlemen, today my speech is going to be mostly focused on China's influence and the benefits of China being a world power. Then I will talk about why we are offering infrastructure rather than aid. Then my second speaker is going to go into a deep argument about the economic benefits of this and how this is a very good alternative for many nations. I'll take you in a second in how this is a benefit for the nations in the Belt and Road Initiative. And my last speaker will be summarizing and offering points of clash. Yes, please.
We told you we're finding the IMF, the World Bank, private investors, anyone who gives good loans, risk assessment. Tell us why China is better than any of these alternatives.
Because what China is doing is giving infrastructure. We are not simply pumping money into these countries, but we are providing them with a platform from which they can build off of, and that is going to be my second substantive point. So you'll see that in a second. Now, on to my first substantive, about China's influence and the effects of China as a world power. In the status quo, what we have many LADC countries, such as Zimbabwe, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, who have little to no influence on a global scale. Now, through this Belt and Road Initiative, we are allowing these developing nations to ally with a superpower like China. We are allowing them to enter the major leagues of economics and politics, which they would otherwise not be able to do. And why is this so important? Because it prevents these nations from being exploited. Now, why are they not being exploited on our side of the house? Because this Belt and Road Initiative is mutually beneficial. Both sides have benefits. China is going to reap benefits because it will have increased influence and because it's giving loans. And these developing nations have benefits because they are increasing their infrastructure and also because they are going to be allied with more powerful nations. No thank you. And it's giving them global recognition. Now, China, at the moment, in the status quo, what we have is one superpower, and that is the USA. And I think that that's a fairly widely agreed statement. Now, under our model, what we are doing is we are redistributing global order. And we're doing that through a theory called structural realist theory. So in the status quo, because we have a unipolar system, which is where America is a superpower, and it's a lot stronger than other countries. And now this means that they have much more control. However, on our side of the house, what we are presenting is the idea of a bipolar system, which means that there are going to be two superpowers. No, thank you. Now this leads to an increased amount of stability in global order because there is more balance. These two powers can balance each other out. Now, part of this is that we are giving these developing nations a choice to ally with the superpower. Now, you continuously brought up this argument how these developing nations, if they want to ally with someone, why not choose the USA? The reason is because the USA is not willing. You continuously bring up these ideas, however, if the USA was going to give these countries loans, then they would have done so by now. However, they have not, and that is why it is imperative for China to appeal to these developing nations that no one else is willing to help. No, thank you. Furthermore, there will be greater connectivity between these nations because of allying with such a powerful nation. Greater connectivity means more trade. More trade means better international relations. And, for example, let's take Africa. After colonialism, Africa was made up of a series of dictatorships. Now, collectively, Africa has one of the biggest economies in the world, but because of the hostility between interregional areas, there is so much they don't work collectively together. However, if they were trading with each other, if they were able to better their international relations, then it is almost undoubtable that that they would be able to reap benefits off of each other. They would be able to work together to better their economy as a whole. Now, for these reasons, we do not regret, the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, Xi Jinping's core vision was to develop a greater economic and political relation through the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, on to my second substantive point. Why are we choosing infrastructure and not aid? Firstly, what's the difference? Aid is essentially pumping money into nations and telling them, do what you want with this. However, on our side, it's much more specified. We are going into countries, providing them with infrastructure, building that infrastructure for them so that it is up to the same standard as the infrastructure in China itself. Yes, please.
China is imposing conditions like 99-year leases on Sri Lanka to build a port. Is it worth trading away 2 generations of sovereignty for a failed speculation?
But that's subjective. That's such a subjective opinion to say that it's failed. How can you prove on your side of the house? Because the thing is, at the end of the day, the Belt and Road Initiative is only 4 years old. How can you already say that you regret it, that it has failed, when in the first 2 years of it being born, it created 180,000 jobs worldwide? Therefore, it's unfair of you to say that it's already failed and that these nations are losing their sovereignty. Because again, they know what they're going into. China is not being closed about this. They are very transparent. Now, back to my point about why it's infrastructure rather than aid. Now, aid is often siphoned off by dictators. They can spend it on whatever they want, building palaces or whatever. And even in non-extreme cases, countries just don't always know what to do with this aid. However, with infrastructure, we are going to be giving them specific uses for this, from which they can manufacture, they can enter new markets, they can enter the secondary sector, and this will essentially allow them to build up their economies. For these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to oppose. Thank you.
8 minutes and 16 seconds. I would like to thank the first speaker of the opposition for their speech, and I would like to invite the second speaker of the proposition to deliver their speech.
When investment banks in the United States gave subprime loans to those who could not ever pay them back, it was regrettable. When the same banks seized all those assets after they failed to repay the loan, it was again regrettable. Panel, if it is indeed true that no institution in the world, ranging from the governments to private institutions, from the Asian Development Bank, backed by Japan, India, to the United States, whoever, if it's true that no one is willing to loan these people money, these countries money, it's probably because these people can't pay them back. It's probably because this is a massive speculation and the risk assessment is not proper. And if an institution is promising free money to these people, it's probably similar to payday loans or loan sharks preying on future targets. Nations trade their sovereignty away when they sign up for the Belt and Road Initiative, and that's the crucial distinction we want to make in this House. So far in the debate, it's clear that their case wants choice and their case wants benefit. In terms of choice, we think that there's a contradiction in the first speech already, because first they say they want choice, and then they say it's better for nations to ally with a superpower in a bipolar world. we think in the comparative, these nations can take loans and can ally with a host of institutions in our side. In their world, they're only restricted to China because when they sign with it, just like the Cold War, they will have to be like an ally to China all the time. On the comparative, we think these nations can seek whatever they want, but B, they can negotiate better rates for them because arguably a host of institutions will be trying to get loan their money to this to the smaller countries. No. Secondly, they say greater connectivity is good and that leads to trade. It almost looks like a horse is leaping. I don't see how the logic really flows in the analysis because there is no analysis there. The bigger point is we think these nations, because they're booming economies, they're likely to get loans from a host of institutions anyway, right? Which means China does not need to be the only member in the country who's giving them loans. Secondly, they want benefits, but because they don't offer us any yet, we don't think benefits flow in their house at all. Firstly, in terms of benefits, we really need to put my first speaker's arguments in context because she told you 4 things. She said A, these nations can't protest against China anymore by the example of Vietnam and South China Sea. B, all the roads lead to China, which means your choice is eroded because your infrastructure is only useful insofar you can trade with China. C, that governments not taken. The governments are trading their sovereignty away for the future by taking 100-year leases. In the comparative, no institution forces you to lease your property for 100 years. Fourthly, you can't enact policies against China. Why is this important? Because this means once you are locked into China, they can force any trade deal on you. If they raise prices because your roads connect to China, you must trade with China. Which means they can seek monopoly profit out of these nations because they're locked into a system of development that only caters to China. The only thing that stops China from doing this now is that these nations can take these loans from a host of institutions. But that does not happen in their world. But B, this is further problematic because we think these nations are not going to get profits out of it, right? And even if they do, the fact that this operates for a very long period of time means that in the future, the sovereignty is traded away as well. There was a principle given in the House, and we had no response from that side. Given this, all of these things are true, the second speaker must tell us why it's worth it to not only gamble with your future economic state as well as your present one. Sure.
You started your speech by saying nobody is going to give these people, these countries, loans because they have such a low credit worthiness. You then went on literally 2 minutes later to say, why can't they just get these loans from different host of nations? Which one is it, sir?
I started my speech by quoting your first speaker when she said, why does the US not give anyone loans? Because she said that these countries will never get loans. I think there are a host of countries and there are a host of incentives here. For lots of these countries, they don't deserve these loans. For some of them, they can negotiate better loans when you let them be. If your first speaker's nuance is true, that these countries do not have any other option, we think the scenario is akin to loan charts for preying on countries who don't have any other option. So now I want to make a transition to my argument. My argument is how is democracy crippled in their world? The premise of this argument is that China is providing quick money to unaccountable leaders who perpetuate undemocratic tyranny in the world. Why is this true? Because China likes one-party democracies or even autocracies because China thinks this gives them stability. That's the reason why they support North Korea and they support so many military-propped governments in Africa. B, it's quite easy to buy the loyalty of these autocrats to ensure these nations remain loyal to the state, to China, right? Because we think this is akin to how China sort of propped and supported Najib Razak even when 600 million disappeared from government coffers. This means these sorts of leaders are very unaccountable and do not have the mind, do not have the interests of the people at their mind, in their minds, but rather their personal interests. On the comparative, why are international institutions better? Because A, these international institutions tend to be multi-government organizations or just countries who are giving bilateral loans. They can be private institutions like the Asian Development Bank and all of these institutions. They tend to do 2 things really well. One, they tend to tie their conditions to human rights record and try to establish rule of law. Why? Because rule of law is crucial to protect your private investment in any country, to avoid the instance like in Bolivia when private assets were seized by the government because the tyrant thought that's a good idea. And the crucial distinction is, since China is tying these nations to 100-year-long leases, because the scale of China's dominance is so much better, the scale of money is so much more, China does not fear sovereignty from these nations. There is a massive power imbalance there. This means they have very little incentive to protect their private assets by pushing for the establishment of rule of law, because their private assets are likely to be stable and safe. If a small bank was doing it, or if the World Bank was doing it, they would still push for policies that establish the rule of law. This also means, secondly, there will be lesser feasibility checks and there will be more corruption, and the business might not even be profitable to start with, because China does not want financial reparation, China wants political dominance. All this means that this allows pseudo-democrats to pressure leaders and to undermine democracy. It undermines the decades work by a host of international agents to push for democratic reforms. B, it undermines the World Bank clauses that try to restrict undue nationalization, nepotism in public sectors, or even things like curbing down free speech. What does it actually look like in the world? It looks like Sheikh Hasina locking up leader of the opposition for life, but boasting meaningful GDP growth figures in the short run to buy her population's silent ignorance. Because people in these countries think that someday development will come, but that never arrives when people are locked up in every day because rule of law is not established. This leads to things like civil liberties being taken down, locking journalists, suppressing rule of law, engaging in corruption, and entrenching inequality, because these tyrants often favor loyalists and oligarchs at the cost of a free market. This means clearly the trickle-down economics never works out, because it's a top-heavy approach where China always prefers the oligarchs, where the money never flows down. This has already happened when Bangladesh democracy 10 years ago has locked up its leader and is currently on its way to a proper autocracy. And this transition was funded by Chinese money, because Bangladesh is taking all of Chinese investments. This has happened in Bangladesh, and it's happening in Cambodia, in Thailand, in Pakistan, and a host of countries in Africa. Madam Speaker, panel, money means nothing if you do not have civil liberties, if you do not have rule of law. And through the One Belt initiative, you trade your sovereignty away, you're locked into a state of tyranny. Extremely proud to stand in proposition.
8 minutes and 17 seconds. I would like to thank the second speaker of the opposition for their speech. I would like to invite the second speaker of the opposition to deliver the speech.
Madam Chair, the world's poorest nations live under a system of oppression, an oppression known as no better alternative. Now, their model suggests that they support any other financial institution to lend to these BRI nations. But the fact of the matter is, they have either not lent to these nations or they have all failed. They characterize the IMF and the World Bank as if they're the most successful financial institutions that have ever existed. Is that why Ethiopia is in crippling debt despite receiving IMF loans? Is that why many nations in Africa all around are crippling debt specifically because of development aid, not in spite of development aid? We completely reject the premise that all other Western institutions that finance these loans are somehow have a perfect premonition of whether they will be able to pay it back or not. We believe that the characterization on their side of the house is inherently xenophobic and is a Western portrayal of the view, and that it is purely speculative to suggest that because China is now stepping up its economic game, that it is somehow anti-democratic and it's entrenching systemic inequalities in society. We absolutely reject this premise. The first speaker came up and said that it strips nations of their sovereignty. The only justification she gave for this is that China would somehow hang debt over its nation's head if they went against China. Now, this is factually incorrect. In fact, what they're doing by having economic ties with BRI nations is forging an alliance. And we believe that this is nothing new, that diplomatic ties are nothing new. It is a fact that in the United Nations, the United States has allies, and they act in the interest of the United States, while the United States acts in their interest as well. We say that there is absolutely nothing wrong with China developing similar diplomatic ties, and it's factually incorrect to say that simply because these nations are financially in debt to them, that they somehow have some sort of hegemonic power over them to control them in the United Nations. We tell you that for the first time in history, nations like Laos, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, nations that live on the fringes of the economic landscape are now brought under discussion. Are you really telling me that China suddenly has the hegemonic power to manipulate these nations that are on the fringes of the political landscape to suddenly act in its interest, and as if that would be of any benefit to China whatsoever? Yes.
If China is building their roads and their ports, if it's giving them billions in money, and there's a huge power disparity between these countries, do you not agree that if they wanted to hold the debt over their heads, they wanted to hold them
Okay, so this ties in with something you said yourself, and that there is no financial incentive for China to reap the rewards of this debt. We think that this is ludicrous. China is investing $1 trillion into the Belt and Road Initiative. And if they did not reap if they did not receive a return on this investment, China in itself will experience a liquidity crisis. So if you're honestly telling me that China is not willing to claim its debt back in the long run, and it doesn't have a vested interest in these nations being able to pay that debt back, we think you're factually incorrect there, and this is again part of your speculative xenophobic narrative of Chinese investment. Now, she talked about US development aid. Now, development aid, ladies and gentlemen, is not generous or munificent. In return for US development aid, often African nations have to give up their rights to mining minerals to the United States. We say that this loots these nations of their natural resources, whereas China is not doing so. What China is doing is investing in infrastructure. You ask what the difference between Chinese loans and United States loans are. We tell you that Chinese loans have a vested interest in developing infrastructure in these nations. We say that it is under strict control of China, and we believe that that is a good thing, because it's the Chinese Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China monitor each and every Belt and Road Initiative project and ensure that they reach fruition. Now, by doing so, what we're doing in the Belt and Road Initiative is not simply riddling these nations into debt. The second speaker came up and very eloquently asked, why is it justified that these economies gamble with future economic conditions? Firstly, we say that it's not a gamble. But if we assume that he's right in asserting that it is a gamble, we say that most of these nations have nowhere to go but up. We say that most of these nations are already in crippling debt because specifically of loans generated by the IMF and institutions like the World Bank and US development aid. We say that if they are already in so much debt, they are offering no mechanism for them to repay the debt. Whereas we believe that the Belt and Road is the mechanism to repay the debt. China is not claiming to be a generous entity. China is very clear in its returns. China expects a 2 to 6% return on interest rate in the long run on the repayments of the loans. China does have a vested financial interest in these nations being able to repay the loans. The difference, however, is that China develops infrastructure. When infrastructure is developed, you're suddenly empowering all these underdeveloped nations who did not have a competitive advantage in their manufacturing sector to suddenly specialize in the production of some goods and services, to industrialize from being largely agricultural and commodity-reliant economies to suddenly becoming manufacturing economies. The power of doing this, ladies and gentlemen, is that you're empowering these nations with the ability to not only service the debt that they owe China, but also service the billions of dollars of debt that they owe the IMF and the World Bank as well. Which brings me to my first constructive for this debate. We talk about the fact that the Belt and Road Initiative allows industrialization near the source of commodities. We say that in nations like Nigeria and Congo, Nigeria has one of the largest reserves and the purest reserves of crude oil, and Congo has one of the largest reserves of copper. However, Nigeria still has fuel shortages, ladies and gentlemen. Nigeria still has to import petroleum and diesel from the Western world because Amsterdam owns all the rights to the fuel in Nigeria. We think that this is fundamentally wrong, and we say that through the Belt and Road Initiative, we are empowering nations like Nigeria to develop its own refineries and to industrialize their own nations, and therefore to export this oil off their own accord and reap the benefits of being the secondary sector-dependent economy. And the impact of this is one, it creates jobs in these nations through the manufacturing sector. And the second impact is that it allows these nations to service their debt by empowering these nations to produce more and therefore also to export more. The revenues from this production and exports are then used to service the debt that they claim will be so crippling and will hang over their head. Yes, ma'am.
You keep telling us that China doesn't want minerals or power, but it only wants money. When these countries default on their loans, what will happen to their minerals and their oil reserves?
Okay, so it is a fact that every loan requires a collateral. Now the difference between US aid demanding mineral rights and China demanding natural resources if the loan is not repaid in time. The difference is that people in Ethiopia get nothing in return for their minerals if the loan is defaulted. However, with China, even if Ethiopia happens to default on their loan and they somehow have to give up their minerals to China, Ethiopia still has the infrastructure that was built through the Belt and Road Initiative. We believe firmly that the infrastructure development is the key difference between any of the aid models they've offered on their side. We firmly believe that empowering these nations with infrastructure is why specifically on our side we're empowering sovereignty, and on their side they're the ones that are removing sovereignty by imposing further development aid models and supposedly financial viable alternatives on these nations that are so immiserated specifically by the narrative of the West. So, in conclusion, we asked the opposition, what option do these nations have to repay their existing mountains of debt? They said that, oh, there must be a reason why no one lends to these nations. We said, fair enough. What is the alternative? They are perpetuating the status quo wherein these nations remain immiserated by the Western narrative. We insist that this is morally abhorrent, ladies and gentlemen, unlike what they assert on their side. We say that the Belt and Road Initiative gives nations a mechanism to lift themselves out of systemic national debt, even if it is at the cost of a short-term debt obligation to China. There is only one way to go for most of these nations, ladies and gentlemen, and that is up. And we say that the potential economic benefits of the Belt and Road Initiative far outweigh any imaginary xenophobic speculations of Chinese imperialism. So for those reasons, we beg you to oppose. Thank you.
8 minutes and 18 seconds. I would like to thank the second speaker of the opposition for their speech and would like to invite the third speaker of the proposition to deliver their speech.
The distinction between what we both agree on is dependency on one country. We've told you we support institutions like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank. We support bilateral loans like between India and Nepal. We do not support one country being able to dominate a host of other countries because they are solely dominant on them. We have told you how they do not have a profit motive, they only have a power motive. They do not care about getting these loans back, they care about the power they have with these countries. Panel, I'm going to be looking at 3 things in this speech today. First, democracy. Second, choice. And finally, looking at countries with this initiative. But first, some outstanding work. Now, if they really agree that these economies are booming, then we say that other people are going to be very happy to give loans to them. We think people like the World Bank will be very happy to fund infrastructure or to give other loans, because they're not going to be in the same way that China is, like a loan shark when they cannot get this loan back. So if they really are booming, this is like a profit motive to go into this. We do not understand why that won't happen on their side. They haven't been very comparative with these booming economies. And also we say they're much better on our side than there is like the power domination thing we've been telling you since our first speaker. Now, let's look at democracy. There was no response as to how we've explained to you how democracy is far worse on the side of the UAE. We've told you how China cares about stability because they like the idea of having power of a stable country. They like autocracies, they like countries which are controlled by the military. They do not care about the people being under a democracy. What happens when a host of different people, including America, but also including the other people, like they can't just form us and tell us that we're only talking about America here. What happens when all of these different institutions want to help these countries? They're going to have more instilled democracy. Why is this the case? We say that when when they give these loans, they're going to tie these conditions with things like human rights development, so like no more human rights violations, but also the rule of law. Why is the rule of law really important to private institutions? Because they do not want the state to be able to take away their private property. Like, these institutions have an incentive to actually instill this rule of law, unlike China. Because China doesn't really care about profit here. They, as we told you, they only care about power. And so, when we instill the rule of law for having private institutions, that's much better for the people within these countries, that's much better for democracy. But also, visibility is so much clearer on our side because they do not want the corruption, because as we have told you, China doesn't really care about like financial reciprocation, they do not really care about getting all of these loans back, they care about the power. And so if there's corruption which is leaking money out of the funds, they do not really care about this because they do not care, as I told you, about the money. They only really care about this dominance, which I told you, dominance is much easier when it's not democratic, but also countries which actually want to get these loans back, like the World Bank, like the Asian Development Bank, probably like America, they actually care about a lack of corruption within these states. It's a bit So after their speaker, they basically dropped this idea that they care about choice. But they told us a few things today. So they told us, first of all, in POI, this isn't lack of sovereignty because some people are making a choice to start with. We're saying you're locked into this choice, which means future generations do not have the right to choose. We think that's probably pretty important because if you're not even born yet, you cannot consent into this choice. We think it's really selfish that the governments are making choices that other people cannot opt out of. This is basically like an irreversible decision, which we think isn't fair on future generations, but it's also not fair on people living in these states now. We've told you 4 reasons as to how they actually don't get sovereignty on their side of the house. We told you how you have to trade with China because it's unprofitable. If all of the roads lead to China, it's not profitable to sell your products to like the US, to sell your products to the West. So the only way to keep your products profitable and to keep your factories running and to keep your jobs going is to trade with China. That is the only way to keep your country running. The second thing we told you is that you have to import Chinese goods because China, as I'll go on, can just like threaten to take away, no thank you, threaten to cause the loan to come in right now. You have to do everything they say. So if China's like, we want you to import all of our goods and you have to have all of the things that we want to sell you, you cannot decline that, and so you have to import from Chinese goods. Obviously that is a lack of sovereignty from these countries. We think a nation state is basically only a state that has power over its people and like control its own sovereignty. We don't think that's really the case when China can control your imports. The third thing I told you is that you have to employ Chinese companies. And all of these things haven't been responded to, by the way, and these came out from our first speaker. But finally, I think really importantly, if you cannot protest, we told you about Vietnam with the South China Sea. This is terrible for the Vietnamese people that their sea is being taken away by China. You cannot protest this because China can then just default and ask for them to be taken straight away. What does this actually mean, and what haven't they quite grasped in this debate today? That when China threatens for a loan to come in right now, you will go bankrupt as a country if you don't say exactly what they say. We told you an analogy about giving poor people loans for huge mansions. When you give a poor person a loan for a huge mansion and they live in it, you can kick them out any time because they'll never be able to repay the loan. But you're not giving them the loan for the mansion because you care about them having 6 bedrooms. You're giving it to them because you care about the power that you have over them. That's the exact thing that's happening here. That's the exact thing that's happening on UAE side of the house. But then they told us, as a bit of a contradiction, that they don't actually care about choice, we just prefer that they align with superpower. We don't understand what's important. There was no analysis as to why, like, 2 superpowers is more stable than 1, like, not really important. But also, as I told you, they can just go with the host of other people's, they don't have to run with superpower. And finally, as much as we like their like said Bo intro about no alternative, like there is an alternative because like some countries possibly are very poor and they cannot repay these loans. We don't think that they should be controlled by China. We don't think these countries should like have to go into this terrible situation. But like we're looking at a range of countries here. It's not just like very poor countries. Some countries are booming, and some countries can go to the World Bank. Like some countries can do these things. We would much rather they do not have the human rights violations. We'd much rather they have democracy eventually. We think that can only happen on our side of the house we've shown you, and they haven't contested at all. What have we told you about choice? We've given you from our first speaker analysis regarding dependency and how there is no choice. So when China threatens to call in these loans, you have to comply with everything they say, or else your country will go bankrupt and you have no more like money left. Like you cannot say no if they call in the loans. You have to do everything they say. You have to do anything they say in regards to the political power they want. Panel, we've told you from our first speaker that their burden is to prove how sovereignty is regained on their side by these countries, and they cannot do this. They cannot win this debate until they prove to us how these states are not controlled by China for 1998. Now let's look at the countries themselves. Now they've told us, that they cannot oppose. We told you how we don't have sovereignty, and currently they're still standing, and so they have to follow everything they say. We think that's probably pretty bad for a country. But then they told us, like, we'd rather this happen with Africa, that would be really good for Africa. We told you how European And then they gave us this like little jump analysis. They were like, good connectivity, good trade, good international relations. Like, we don't think that's really important because there was no analysis and we don't buy it at all. But also, China doesn't care about these countries. Like, President Xi was bragging at the most recent party conference about how great it is for China to dominate the trade in the East. Like, he doesn't care. He's not bragging about we're so great and I'm so humbled that we're helping these countries. He doesn't care about Vietnam. He doesn't care about Cambodia. He cares about having dominance over Eastern trade. Like, the fact that they're trying to characterize that he's like, yay, we're really helping the East. Not at all. He only cares about his own country, and that's why they want the dominance because of power. They don't care about getting these loans back. They care about having power over trade. They care about dominating. Like, that's why it's called One Belt, One Road. It's a belt around the East and all the roads into China. This is terrible for these countries. And finally, they were like, we're good that this is infrastructure, not aid. Like, the World Bank can build infrastructure. That's not comparative at all. But also, the roads mean nothing if you don't want to trade with China. So, like, what's the point of infrastructure if you don't want to trade with China? Like, that's how we don't get any choice on our side, because these roads mean nothing unless you decide with the Chinese. These people don't get any choice. And we think that's really important for a country, and they dropped that point after their first speaker. We get choice on our side, we get better democracies, and we get better control for these countries. Panel, I'm very proud to propose.
8 minutes and 22 seconds.
Madam Chairman, panel. Today, Team Proposition has had a myriad of cherry-picked statistics which they've purposefully fitted conveniently to create a very weak argument based purely on speculation. Right? So what I'm going to try and do today is to deal with the arguments they brought forward and tell you how simple and easily, based on practical economic understanding, and quite frankly in some cases common sense, we can break this rather feeble argument they've created. So let's start with the major point of clash, which has been this idea of China holding their debt above everybody and saying, you know, we've given you 1 trillion in debt, so now you've got to do exactly what we've said. And then they went on to say, you know, but that's not going to happen if these African countries take a part of their loan from the World Bank and apart from Europe and apart from America. And I was thinking very, very, hard about how am I going to dispute this? And the third speaker did it for me when she said that even when Europe gave these loans, there was massive debt obligation and Europe was luring these loans over people's heads. So my question to you is, if Europe did it, how can you then argue that if now we don't take the loans from China, but instead we take it from America, something different is going to happen? And more importantly, how can you argue, based purely on speculation, that China is in fact going to call in $1 trillion of debt? The fact of the matter is that China knows that none of these countries can overnight produce $1 trillion of liquid cash. And they will not ask for it because when those countries default, which they will in the short term if you ask for $1 trillion in debt, China will be the one facing a liquidity crisis. China will be the one who suffers from massive economic leakage, and China will be the one who suffers an economic recession. Not these countries, they just say we default, that's it. Alright? So that is the first and principal argument. This idea that China will lure this debt over people's head is not going to happen because China understands that it can never be paid overnight, and therefore they will not ask for such a thing. Alright? The second, and this is quite a worrying argument, thank you. The worrying argument, this idea of trade, right? And they said, what's the point of doing all this because all the roads lead to China, so if you don't want to trade with China, what's the point? Firstly, just a commonsensical thing, all roads go 2 ways, right? No road goes only one way. If the road goes to China, it also goes away from China, right? So and the whole point of this Belt and Road Initiative, the reason it's called Belt and Road, not One Belt, One Road anymore, is that the idea is integration in trade between Europe and Asia, integration in trade between Africa, Europe, and Asia. The idea is that these roads, every road, the road that brought us from our hotel to the school, also leads us back from the school to the hotel. So this argument that's only going one way is ridiculous. Secondly, why would the country not want to trade with China? Why would the country not want to trade with China? What is wrong with trading with China? China is the largest consumer, the largest exporter. So why would I not want to purchase cheap exports from China? And why would I not want to sell exports my exports to China? We are improving connectivity not only to China, but also to Europe and to Africa. And that is the benefit of the Belt and Road Initiative, not the One Belt, One Road Initiative. Right? This other argument has been that, and this has been a massive contradiction again, which I pointed out, which they did not respond to, was this idea that, at first they said, look, all these countries have very bad credit scores, and we agree. Moody's and other credit, credit institutions don't rate them very highly. All right. So you said that they have really bad credit scores, therefore they will not get any loans from anybody else. So why is China doing this? Surely there's some selfish motive, because who gives loans to people with bad credit scores? And literally 5 minutes later, they went on to say, well, actually, we suggest that these poor countries, who 2 minutes ago nobody was giving a loan to, they should try and finance these loans to the World Bank, the IMF, America, and Europe. So I ask you again, this is the third time I've asked you, you have not responded. Which one is it? Are these countries unable to get a loan from anywhere else, or are they able to get a loan? If they have a bad credit score, nobody's giving them a loan. So it's good, I'll take it a second, it's good that China's giving them a loan. Isn't it better to have a country who's willing to take a risk with these poor countries, or is it better to just say, let them try and finance it, which they have not been able to do, which you yourself admitted to? Yes.
There is no Chinese liquidity crisis, because if the countries default, then China seizes all of their assets.
Alright, thank you. And how do you expect China to sell $1 trillion worth of assets, alright, when they have basically asked 47 countries to default on their loans? So what you've created is a situation where, yes, this is exactly what happened in the mortgage crisis they talked about, where, alright, people who are subprime loans defaulting. What did the bank do? They seized houses. What happened to the price of houses? They fell because nobody could buy them. The reason we default, ladies and gentlemen, is because we do not have liquid cash to purchase the assets. So how do you suggest that if we cannot even satisfy our loan obligation, we will suddenly be able to buy back the infrastructure that we couldn't even satisfy our loan obligation for? That is exactly what happened in the credit crisis of 2008, where the banks tried to resell the assets they just seized, and that resulted in massive mark-to-market and crystallized losses, and that is why many of the banks went bust. So once again, even if we seize assets, China will not be able to sell it, and there will be a liquidity crisis in China. Right? So that's that argument. Then this other idea that, sovereignty. And they said that, it's not fair to be locked in for the next 99 years based on the decisions made today, and, you are controlling us and all that. Well, I ask you, what is the difference between China building infrastructure, which we're stuck with, except for the benefit from a supply-side economic policy, which I will bring up in the future rebuttal to what you said later on in my speech, and what America has done, and what Europe has done, where they have gone into these African countries, exploited them for all their commodities, so there's nothing but barren soil left. Is that not in itself also the notion that these countries allowed themselves to be exploited, gave up their sovereignty, and now for the next 20 generations, they don't have any more oil in the ground, they don't have fertile soil, they can't trade in commodities because America came and took it all. It's the exact same argument. So how do you suggest that America will not do this again if we take loans from them? I frankly do not understand. The other argument is that there is actually no evidence to suggest that China will do any of this. There is no evidence to suggest that China will create an initiative and then purposefully try and break down the countries who are an integral part of it. This is purely speculation. Look, the Belt and Road Initiative is 4 years old. How can you argue the next 99 years, the next 100 years, based on 4 years of precedence when the Belt and Road is not even completed yet? It's ludicrous, ladies and gentlemen. The argument hinges on speculation, and the problem with speculation is it can easily be refuted with economic fact and theory, and that is exactly what we've done. Again, we talk about this idea of sovereignty. We brought this up before, let's bring it up again. If somebody chooses to be a part of something, then you cannot argue that they are not sovereign. Look, of course, everybody can say that what happened, future generations didn't have a call in what happened now. But the point is, every country, even if a country makes economic decisions internally, future generations are not going to have a choice on that. If today, as America, Trump decides, or if Africa decides, we want protectionist policies, is that also unsovereign because future generations 100 years from now will look back and say, well, that's not fair because they did it 100 years ago, we didn't have a chance to talk about that. No, they're not going to. Every country makes decisions based on the economic benefits of it. If we see economic benefits, we will make those decisions. That is exactly what these countries are doing. So this idea of sovereignty and then being forced into something is frankly not true. I'll give you an example. India has not yet subscribed, the largest democracy in the world has not yet subscribed to the Belt and Road Initiative because they feel it's not right for them, because it feels that it's going to encroach on Indian-occupied Kashmir, which they do not want. As a result of that, they have stepped out and they have not actually accepted it. So you do have a choice. Just if you choose not to implement it, doesn't mean you're giving up your sovereignty. You are opting into something, and that is perfectly fine. That is exercising the right, and that is exercising your sovereignty. Ladies and gentlemen, we've also talked about this idea of the supply-side benefits from the economics point of view. Let's go back to this argument they've made today about the idea that, these countries won't be able to finance their loans. I would argue that the Belt and Road Initiative and the economic benefits occurring from that is what will help them finance these loans in the first place. If you have better infrastructure, you have supply-side economic growth, you have increase in wealth, your exports become more competitive, you have inflow of capital, you have the financial market being developed, all of these things will help finance the loan. Ladies and gentlemen, let's end with a Chinese proverb. Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. China is teaching how to fish, and they will feed you for life. Thank you.
8 minutes and 19 seconds.
The proposition's argument today is characterized by three things. Firstly, concession. Secondly, contradiction. And thirdly, hyperbole. They give you the proverb that on our side we're suggesting that a poor person is given a loan to buy a new mansion, but that's fundamentally not what the Belt and Road Initiative is. The Belt and Road Initiative is more so about giving a poor person a loan to go study at university so that eventually he can go work somewhere, earn money back, and repay the loan. That is what China is doing through infrastructure development. This is a point that they have not considered, that they have not contested from first through third speech, and therefore, at least on principle, this whole idea of hanging a debt obligation over Belt and Road Initiative nations' heads is fundamentally flawed. Now, the main clash in this debate was one of sovereignty, right? And their only justification from first through third for why the Belt and Road Initiative would infringe upon sovereignty is that China would force certain countries to make certain decisions on global platforms because these nations were in debt to China. This is ridiculous. You have contracts that have a certain period of maturity when you're supposed to pay the loan back. China can't just say, pay me $1 trillion tomorrow because I said so. This is a financial contract. It's laid out in stone when these nations are expected to pay China back. The nation knows this, China knows this, and therefore there is no clandestine political influence underneath this financial obligation. So this is an absolute wash, right? Now, ironically enough, the second clash in this debate was one of democracy. And the model they suggested was US development aid, one of the largest reasons for anti-democratic practices in Africa, ladies and gentlemen. The whole the travesty of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe is specifically because of US development aid. US development aid is one of the largest reasons for political conflict, for corruption, and so on and so forth. I don't think I need to speak about this any further. The fact of the matter is that China ensures that these projects are completed to fruition. China oversees all these projects and ensures that no money is passed through to corrupt dictators and so on and so forth. The only real example they gave you of conflict arising from Chinese money, not Chinese Belt and Road money, was the Bangladesh conflict. And it doesn't matter whether or not you concede this because this is fundamentally divorced from the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Now, they also told you that some countries cannot protest areas of contention where China has a vested interest. For example, Vietnam and the South China Sea. But the fact of the matter is, this is a horrible example because Vietnam still does contest the South China Sea despite being in obligation to China. And so in this sense, they have fundamentally contradicted themselves. And we say that China has no interest in controlling the sovereignty of the country or making nations anti-democratic per se. China's only interest is one, to make a financial return on their investment in the form of interest rates, which they are perfectly clear with, and secondly, to facilitate greater global trade. Which brings me to the point of the fact that all roads lead to China and that this is somehow a bad thing. This is ridiculous. The Belt and Road Initiative has a belt that literally goes between Europe and Africa. The point is that transportation infrastructure is non-excludable and it is non-rival, and that anybody who wishes to use it to facilitate trade may do so as long as it is going through their land. And so to say that this only benefits China is fundamentally flawed, because there are benefits of trade that are multilateral to every nation that the Belt and the Road go through, right? So the only alternative they presented was World Bank, IMF, and US development aid loans. And then they said that the World Bank would be happy to lend to these nations if they were truly economically booming. But the fact is, these nations are not economically booming. Ladies and gentlemen, all I ask on this side of the house is, what did they have to prove to you? Is the Belt and Road Initiative inherently regrettable? And this is fundamentally retrospective, right? So we're talking about the last 4 years. Has the last 4 years given us reason to regret the Belt and Road Initiative, and we say no. Because for the one example they gave you of the 99-year lease in the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, there are 100 other examples of successful projects completed under the Belt and Road Initiative. And so we say purely on principle, there is not enough evidence to regret the Belt and Road Initiative. And so for these reasons, we firmly beg you to oppose this motion.
4 minutes and 18 seconds. I would like to thank the reply speaker of the opposition for their speech and would like to invite the reply speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
Usually an argument goes premise, analysis, impacts. But their case was premise, no analysis, and calling out xenophobic. Because that is a team who comes to a debate and calls the other team xenophobic without giving a semblance of an analysis. That is a team who tries to strawman our case by saying we only supported US-backed loans or apparently development with a word that we never even uttered, probably was prepped in their prep time to start with, and they never adapted to the debate. We made the distinction very clear from the first second. We told you we do not like an absolute reliance on one debtor because that debtor can dominate what conditions you are exposed to and can dominate everything. We preferred nations taking loans from a host of international institutions which range from many different countries of the World Bank, private banks, whatever. The problem was when the scale and the dominance of one institution was massive, they had the power to manipulate whatever you wanted. And that's the distinction they never got in the debate and completely strawmanned us. Apparently all our analytical harms are speculative because the Belt and Road only started 4 years ago. But all their benefits about economic development are not speculative because the Belt and Road also happened 4 years ago. Right? That is a case, that is a team that never really engaged with analytical arguments, right? They simply said, this is a speculation. We think at least if it is a speculation, ours had analysis and theirs had nothing. Let's start the debate and look where this debate took place. In the principle, they liked choice. The first speaker liked choice, the second two speakers did not like choice. The first speaker said that she likes choice, but she knifed herself by saying they would like to ally themselves with a large superpower. We contested by saying if you really like choice, it's probably better to not ally yourself strictly with one superpower, but have a range of options open. Secondly, we said these roads lead to China. So essentially, you have no choice to switch trade 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, if China hikes up prices. And that's what the analysis was, right? That China can do predatory pricing once you're locked into a state of infrastructure that only leads it back into China. They never contested by telling you how would these nations escape from that mode of predatory pricing. What alternatives will they have? Because they have no alternatives. This clearly means in the principal debate, my first speaker's 4 principal reasons as to why sovereignty was important was the distinguishing factor, and we clearly, crushingly win that principle. When she tells you that there's a distinction of scale, there's a distinction of time. The project is massive, there's a power disparity, and also the leases usually range up to 100 years. A private loan from World Bank does not go to 100 years. If these institutions default, China will seize all its assets for 100 or even more years. We think there was a distinction that they chose not to engage on. Then let's look at the benefits. They said trade happens. We said China can easily hike up prices once you're locked into that mode of infrastructure. Secondly, if trade indeed is profitable, that could have happened regardless. We think the trade if there are a host of countries and China is pushing this Belt and Road in all countries by giving them easy money, some countries should not take it, and we told you how this is akin to speculation, and we told you how China gains from the speculation because they can seize their assets, which they conceded will happen. This means China is likely to dominate, and this trade will not be beneficial for these nations. But secondly, these nations should have the option to choose their best partners later, which they cannot do if they take this option. Thirdly, the third speaker talked about, India did not accept it because China might encroach upon Kashmir. When my Prime Minister told you the same can happen in Vietnam, apparently that wasn't logical, right? Clearly that thing is not consistent. China is a nation that encroaches upon other nations' interests, and we think that characterization is true throughout our case, and those things are likely to happen. In conclusion, we gave you a very clear distinction. We do not like an over-reliance, we do not like over-dependency because we prefer sovereignty to anything else. It's far better when you have a range of options, a range of choices, and you can select the best deal for now and also for the next 100 years. Extremely proud to propose in side proposition.